Good day, everyone. My name is Yulia Chikunaeva, and I'm Director of Clean Growth Leadership Network. We are delighted that you are joining us today. The Clean Growth Leadership Network, CGLN, is in partnership with the Institute for Economics and Peace, is hosting today a webinar reflecting on the year of chaos, reimagining the road ahead. During the session, our panelists would be reflecting on climate change, COP26, COVID-19, and where to from here if we are to build societal resilience and prosperity in an age of unprecedented global change. Climate change is the biggest threat that modern humans have ever faced, but we have yet to implement the solutions needed to both mitigate and reverse its effects. We see the climate crisis as an opportunity for business and innovators to meet this great challenge, which can be compared to the Industrial Revolution. The world needs systems-based solutions, and it needs them now. To help achieve that, CGLN is building a world-class network of business leaders, scientists, academics, and policymakers to collaborate and confront this monumental task. We are thrilled to co-host the webinar today with the Institute for Economics and Peace, and we hope that this session would be helpful for participants to review, reflect, and act on how to create more resilient societies in the 21st century. Without any further delay, let me introduce our moderator today, Lee, who is Deputy Director of Operations for Europe and Middle East and Northern Africa region at the Institute for Economics and Peace. Lee, over to you.
Thank you. From the IPCC's climate change report that sounded a code red for humanity, to the ongoing COVID pandemic that has put the spotlight on enduring and widening inequality, 2021 has brought home the reality of what may have been known and indeed cautioned against for some time, that humanity is nearing a tipping point. To help us make sense of existential threats that we face, to reflect on some of the key moments of 2021, and more importantly, to explore practical long-term approaches to not just adapting, but thriving in an age of unprecedented global change, the Clean Growth Leadership Network, together with the Institute for Economics and Peace, have brought together leading global thinkers in their fields. Today, we welcome Joan McNaughton, who is currently the chair of the Climate Group, a non-executive director of EM Plus Group, and chair of the International Advisory Board at the New Energy Coalition of Europe. Professor Dame Henrietta Moore, who is founder and director of the Institute for the Global Prosperity and the chair in Culture, Philosophy, and Design at University College of London. And we have Steve Kilalea, who is the founder and executive chairman of the global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, and he is also the creator of the Global Peace Index. Let's begin with perhaps one of the most anticipated conferences of the year, COP26 and the inescapable urgency of climate change. Steve, the Institute for Economics and Peace released its annual ecological threat report just prior to COP26. The report showed that while many ecological threats are not directly correlated with climate change itself, the latter can lead to further ecological degradation and trigger conflicts in many countries. Can you briefly walk us through the key findings of the ecological threat report and what struck you the most from this year's report? Additionally, based on the findings, what are your key recommendations for how we approach climate change?
Oh, thank you for the question, Leah. So I think the first thing I want to emphasise is that climate change, as we move forward, particularly over the next 50 years, is going to create serious impacts on a lot of existing problems already. So with the ecological threat report, we focused on the ecological degradation, which is there today. But what really struck me in this year's report was the relationship, and the intimate relationship, between conflict and ecological degradation. Now, we're all familiar with sort of the vicious cycle. You get ecological degradation, that leads to conflict over scarce resources. That conflict degrades the resources and it moves further on. But what really struck me, when we looked at the 15 countries with the worst ecological degradation, 11 of them are currently in conflict, and the other 4 are on our watch lists. In fact, the country which was worst on the list was Afghanistan. So what we did then is we took the countries with the worst ecological degradation, then compared them to resilience or societal resilience, because through measures like positive peace, which we have at the Institute for Economics and Peace, you can measure the resilience of a country. And what we found, we picked the 30 hotspot countries, if you like. And what was striking is 28 of those 30 countries in the bottom half of the Global Peace Index. In fact, most of them are down in the bottom 20%. And so as we looked deeper into it, what we found is it's a lot more than just the ecological degradation. It's a whole system. And so you've got a whole range of things which are coming together, which are really causing these issues. And so the first thing is you've got overpopulation in many of these areas, rampant population growth, which I'll come back to in a minute. You've got very, very weak governance as well. And because you've got very, very weak governance and very, very weak infrastructure, you can't capture the necessary water to produce the agriculture needed to be able to support the population. Now, when we went to the other end of the scale and we looked at the countries with the highest levels of societal resilience as measured by positive peace, now a number of them are going to be badly affected by climate change, but none of them have an existential threat through ecological degradation. Most of them have quite manageable population growth. So let's come back and let's look at Africa and look at some of the drivers which are going on there. And this will give insight into the future for sub-Saharan Africa, particularly the Sahel. So if we look, the population in Africa is estimated or projected to grow by 90% over the next 30 years. That's up to 2050. In fact, there's 12 countries where the populations will more than double. Niger in the Sahel is projected to have the largest population growth at 161%. Now, if we look into Africa today, so think about those population growth and just hold it. So if we look today, what we'll find is 2/3 of the people in sub-Saharan Africa are food insecure. Now, if we look at that figure globally, that figure has increased by 44% since 2014. That's 44%. That's stunning. Now, if we went back to the decades before that, food insecurity had been improving up to 2014, deteriorated every year since. So just to put that into more perspective, if we look at the world today, 30% of the world is food insecure, 2.3 billion people. Now, in terms of recommendations, so these problems, when you start to think of them, it's a wicked problem. What's needed is for us to reimagine the way we're going about doing development. Because one of the things which I've alluded to, these problems are systemic in nature. And to talk about systems now would be a very, very long answer, so I'm not going to get into the detail of it. These problems are systemic in nature. But you need to understand what the problem is from a systemic perspective before starting to try and design and implement a solution. And then whatever the body is which is going to implement that solution, it has to be designed on systemic lines, which is not the way we operate today. So I think the recommendation for me is really to tackle these problems. They're wicked, they're really severe, going to get worse, but they must be taken from a systems perspective and really be able to analyse and clearly design a solution.
Joan, you noted during COP26 that history shows we can make commitment, then raise our ambitions afterwards. Can you provide us with some examples and where in particular we need to raise our ambitions if our targets are to be met? Additionally, having attended previous COP summits, what struck you the most about this year's conference?
Well, thank you for the question. I think one general point I'd make, given the earlier contribution, is that the COP is about trying to, preserve our way of life and our sustainability while building prosperity. So in that sense, I think it fits in very well with the kind of aspirations we've been hearing about. Setting goals is really important. Making those commitments is an important first step because they actually drive action. And by learning by doing, people then gain confidence to set more ambitious goals. So you've asked me if I can think about an example, and I'll start quite close to home for myself, which is in the UK. In 2003, the energy strategy of the United Kingdom, the Energy White Paper, set a goal of emissions reduction of 60% by 2050 for energy policy. Now, I believe it was the first country to do this, and even within government, there was a lot of hesitation about whether to have that goal. But the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was very committed to climate action, and he insisted on it being a goal of our energy policy. Now, what's happened since then is in 2008, there was passed a Climate Change Act. And the Climate Change Act imposes on the UK government 5-year legally binding carbon budgets, carbon emission reduction budgets. And these have become progressively more ambitious so that the latest which has been set, they're set a bit ahead of time for obvious reasons, requires a reduction from the baseline of 1990, the same baseline as in 2003, of 78% by 2035. Now that's important for two reasons. One is that it's very ambitious, but the second is it shows that the government isn't just setting some distant target for 2050 and then sitting back in the comfortable knowledge that they won't be the politicians who have to account for whether it's been delivered or not. We also have, as part of that machinery, an independent advisor called the Climate Change Committee, and they monitor progress. And the Climate Change Committee has said that at the moment, we're on course for delivering the first 3 carbon budgets. Well, the first 2 have already been delivered. The third one ends next year. The 4th and the 5th, not all the indicators are going in the right direction. But again, that's important because if you have a stretch target and you monitor your progress, then you know what the gap is and you know what else you need to do. So I think that's a really good example, and I wouldn't want to pretend that the UK is the best in the world or the only country that's doing this. But I have noted, and I had a conversation with government members from another country recently, that other countries are now adopting similar sorts of mechanisms, even a similar kind of budgeting mechanism. And the other point I'd mention is that this drives the overall perception of what government should be doing. So more and more countries now are committing. Again, in 2019, the UK was the first to legislate for a net zero goal by 2050. So there we started with 60%. Now we're at nearly 100%, except anything that can be offset. And now over 90% of emissions covered by countries are subject to that net zero goal. So I think that's the role of targets, and that's why ambition matters. And it's not just national governments either. We know that local government, local communities are often responsible for taking the decisions that will impact on whether emission reductions are achieved. And the climate group, which I have the honour to chair, convenes a group of those local governments called the Under 2 Coalition. Now that group was set up at the Paris COP, and when they were set up, the ambition was to take actions that were compatible with, aligned with, an under 2 degree scenario. But in the light of the science, the recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that actually it's going to be fairly intolerable if we reach even 2 degrees of global warming. All the focus now is on 1.5 degrees. And at this COP, the members of that coalition agreed to increase their ambition to scenarios that are compatible with 1.5 degrees. So that's another example of ambition increasing over time. The local governments are really important because of the action at community level, but also you get a bit of political competition with the national governments. And so that drives action, which is important. And then we have business and investors, because frankly, the overwhelming majority of the money that will need to be invested in clean energy, in new infrastructure, in innovation in products and services will come from the private sector, from businesses and from the investors who finance businesses. And they are increasing their ambition. I can remember the first few businesses taking action, and that seemed a very radical thing to do. Now, on the boards where I sit and the businesses with whom I interact, this is an absolute top focus for action and for their business planning. It's coming into the mainstream. So that's another important aspect of having ambition, that it comes into your day-to-day work and planning, and that's the only way we're going to realise the changes that are needed. You asked me as well what was different about this COP, and given what I just said, I mean, I could say far too much probably, but I'd like to highlight the role of business and the role of local governments, the states, the regions, the provinces. They were so much more prominent at this COP than at previous ones. And that's partly because they're all now much more active, much more engaged, and have a story to tell and learnings to share among each other. But it's also because the COP presidency, the UN who run the COPs from year to year with the different governments who take the COP presidency, they all realise how vital the contribution of those two groups is. So that to me was extremely satisfying, and extremely satisfying when you think that this COP, beyond any of the other COPs where I have attended, was all about delivery and implementation and not about some high-level statement of intent. So that was the other big difference in this COP, I think. We have moved from discussing what we should do and who should do it to actually getting on with doing it.
Henrietta, from your perspective, are we adequately involving grassroots community in the production of new types of knowledge when it comes to climate change? Is the tide turning here?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think maybe the tide is turning a little. But as Steve is saying, the first thing is we need to reimagine the way that we're going about things, because if we want more resilient societies, then we can't keep focusing entirely on individual actions. And that's mostly how we address individuals and communities at the moment. We say things like, you should reduce your carbon footprint or get on your bicycle. All these things are important, but they're not enough to secure the kind of systemic change that Steve has been talking about. So we need, as you said in your introduction, to think about not just how we withstand the impact of the climate crisis and indeed the biodiversity crisis that's alongside it, but how do we thrive in the future? And we can see that if we look at COP, for example, and the kinds of solutions that came out of COP, that there's very little evidence that the international community is thinking about future thriving. Many of us are, but in that conversation, it was hard to see it really coming to the fore. So we need to think about three different kinds of impacts that we're worried about at the moment. So the first, of course, is the direct one, so flooding, forest fires, and so on. The second is the indirect one. That's the social, political, and economic impacts of the climate crisis itself, of which water is one, which Steve has already mentioned, and its very intimate connection to migration. So that's an issue. And then the third kind of impact is the impact that will come from the transitions required to address these intertwined crises adequately. And that we see very little evidence of any sort going on. Now, communities are our major resource for this in the future, the major way in which we will tackle this. They're not going to do it alone, but it's very, very important to think about what communities are already doing. So, for example, across the UK, we can see there are lots of initiatives that are there, which are having actually a fairly marked impact on that question of how do we deal with the immediate direct consequences. They haven't always arisen because people think of them as addressing climate change or biodiversity loss, but that's what effectively they're doing. So suddenly, for example, in England alone, we have now about 300 distributed energy community organizations which provide energy for people. We have a growing number of community supported agricultural activities, which is, people either working in partnership with farmers or where farms are run by a community. So there are about 100 in the UK at the moment, but we're well behind the curve there because there are around 2,000 in France and around 12,000 in the USA. So we could be doing more there. We have growing communities, growing food in our urban environments and providing organic food at affordable prices for people. We have community land trusts who are buying up land and using it to provide low carbon, affordable housing. And all of this kind of thing is extremely important, but you have to set these local initiatives in the context of two things. So one is this set of intersecting systems that Steve was talking about. And the second is the question of governance, because communities can't do this alone. And what we need is to have a new forms of collaboration between communities and business and NGOs and local government and indeed national government. And when you bring people together in new kinds of multi-stakeholder organizations like that, you have an opportunity to start a different kind of conversation. And from that different kind of conversation comes potentially new forms of knowledge, and from that new forms of value and new forms of action. So we really need to focus on this governance issue. That's very important. And what's the context that all this community activity is taking place in? Is there adequate support across the piece? And that's very important. I mean, let's just take the case of housing. So housing in the UK is a major problem because it accounts for around UK households account for around about 40% of all carbon emissions. And around 10,000 people die each year because they're living in homes that are too cold. And approximately 8.4 million people in England live in unaffordable, insecure, and unsuitable housing. That's an awful lot of people. There is a major ongoing crisis around housing. And when we work with communities, talking to them about what matters to them for prosperity, housing is right on the top of their list. Yet if we were going to bring solutions together to hammer that problem through and do something about it, we need to have working systems working at the local level, which take account of local people's experience and how they see things, how they can tackle things, how they can bring co-design to the piece. But we need to have engineers in there and architects and planners and the suppliers, the communities themselves, and all of the business people and the various people who are running value chains to do things like recycle building materials, use passive ventilation and heating, optimize the windows, install the heat pumps and the solar systems, and deploy the distributed digital systems and the new technologies that would be needed to collaboratively integrate these alternative ideas into existing systems. So you can see that what's important here is, yes, communities are the starting point, but what we need is coordination, collaboration, and sharing to bring about change across these very complex ecologies. So communities are doing lots, but they need a lot more help than they're currently getting.
Right, right. And Joan, looking back to you, you've mentioned that good policy is key also when it comes to the energy trilemma. Can you briefly walk us through what the energy trilemma means and which countries have managed to balance the goals most effectively? How do they do it?
The Energy Trilemma is an exercise which the World Energy Council runs each year. The World Energy Council is a global grouping of countries, governments, and businesses who are there to improve performance in the energy sector. The assessment, which is over 120 countries' energy policies, looks at respected data from institutions such as the IMF or the International Energy Agency. And it assesses energy policies according to 3 criteria against the data available from those sources. Now, the 3 criteria are energy security, because clearly it's crucial to any well-functioning economy that energy should be reliably available. Environmental sustainability, which covers things such as impact on climate, but also impact on local resources, air quality, and so forth. And energy access and affordability. We know that one of the important UN Sustainable Development Goals is that everyone should have access to affordable and reliable energy. And so when you look at those criteria, you are able to assess how well countries' policies are working and rank them. And what do we find when we rank them? Well, we find that actually there are some things that don't matter. Countries that happen to have a very good endowment of energy resources, that's not necessarily associated with better performance on those criteria. By and large, it is true that the more affluent countries perform better, probably because they have more of a legacy of reliable infrastructure and more capacity for policy making. But it's not an absolute correlation. There are some standout performers from relatively less affluent countries, and I'd single out Costa Rica, who outperform many richer countries year on year on year. The third thing we find is that the success depends not on whether you happen to prefer this particular policy to another policy, so you may be much more highly regulated or less highly regulated, but actually how well you implement the policies that you've chosen. And what does good implementation mean here? Well, the policies have to be clear, so people understand what they are. They have to be consistent. So they have to be consistent over time, because a lot of changes, a lot of actions on the policies are not deliverable within a short period of time, within a year. Some of these investments are multi-year investments and so on. You have to have consistency of decision-making and the predictability of regulatory decisions, because that's important to lower the cost of capital, to lower the political risk associated with investments in those countries. And you have to be consistent with other policies across government. So there's no point in having a policy which is extremely well formed, but very narrow, because a lot of these policies interact with each other. I mean, the classic example is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is really important for emissions. And unless you get your energy efficiency right, there's no point in investing in lower emission energy sources, because you're still wasting quite a lot of that energy. And actually, it doesn't help with sustainability, it doesn't help with affordability. And we all know how important it is for us to tackle what in some countries is called fuel poverty, where people cannot afford the energy they need for a decent quality of life. So you do need a more system-based approach to your energy policy. And then your policies need to be set in a transparent way and in consultation with others who are involved. So I've said before that national governments are not the only deliverers of action, for example, on emission reductions. That happens at local government level, local policymakers, community level. And of course, it also engages businesses who have a really fundamental part to play. So overall, you're looking for a coherent and predictable set of policies which create an investment grade framework of policy for businesses to make the commitments, to build the factories or build the infrastructure, and then to deliver the energy securely, sustainably, reliably, and affordably to everybody.
Moving on from climate change to our focus on building back better post-COVID-19. Henrietta, you've noted that radical ideas will be key. For example, you've noted that using GDP alone to determine prosperity is inadequate and misleading, leading policymakers to draw faulty conclusions about levels of prosperity and appropriate interventions. Steve, you too have said that GDP remains a major measure used to determine social health or well-being despite its severe limitations. Henrietta, how should we be defining and measuring prosperity? Where have we gone wrong?
Well, it's again a very good question. So when we're thinking about redesigning prosperity for the 21st century, I think what's important is it's not just a question of how we measure it, but how we conceptualize it, as you implied in your question. And here I think we need to think about what has GDP done. So GDP has done a lot of heavy lifting for sort of national macroeconomic policy over the years. There's no doubt about that. But think about it in these terms. For me, GDP is a 20th century tool, not a 21st century tool. It's a kind of mechanistic lever. So the idea is what we need to do is get growth in the economy, push GDP up, and then we will have trickle down to everybody else and everyone will benefit because the economy is growing. Yeah. And what we've seen over the period of the last 30 years in particular is that this process hasn't been working at all. So it works for a few people, but it doesn't work for the majority of people. And that's because the kind of changes we need to deal with now are these complex ecologies of interlocking systems. And complex ecologies of interlocking systems are non-linear dynamic systems. You cannot change them by pulling a mechanistic lever, right? And GDP is just one great big mechanistic lever. It's like opening the tap, right? At least you hope that's what it's going to do. It's fill up all the buckets. Actually, it doesn't work like that. So one of the things that we ought to be doing is we've known this for at least the last 30 years and have been discussing it for at least the last 30 years. So the question is, why haven't we done something about it, right? Now, I think part of the problem there is because it's taken us a little while to understand that in macroeconomic theory basically thinks of people's well-being in life, if you like, as an aggregate of all of the individual well-beings that exist in a particular context or society or nation, if you like. And what we're beginning to realize now is that that's not how it works. So we cannot get to the well-being of everybody by looking at GDP, and we can't get to GDP by looking at the well-being of individuals. There's a sort of gap in the middle that's emerged in the way we're theorizing in economics, and that's created problems for us. So for example, in the UK, we have this rhetoric, which is very common all around the world, of leveling up, building back better, inclusive growth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those phrases are attempts that we're all making to come to grips with this problem that GDP isn't really measuring well-being for ordinary people. So what do we do about this? Well, the first thing that we have done about it is that we started by thinking about what ordinary people say is driving the quality of life for them in their context. How do they see this question of prosperity? What would make their life better? What is quality of life for them? What are their aspirations and their hopes? And how does that set or is sitting embedded within longer running issues about drivers and trends and so on? And we've done that work in Africa, in the Middle East, and in the UK. And we've begun to develop what we call a citizen-led prosperity index, which is also something that has the added advantage of being something that local people themselves can monitor as to whether or not anything is actually shifting on that index. So what I'm saying in short is that we need to start working with things that work at the local level for ordinary people, but are attached in ways that are comprehensible for policymakers to macroeconomic trends. And I think we've pretty much cracked that now. We need a redefinition of prosperity and economic value that's less concerned with aggregate economic wealth and growth, and more attentive to the things that people care about: secure and good jobs, good public services, clean and healthy environment, social and economic inclusion, planetary and ecosystem health. And that these are the foundations for a prosperous life. So what we would like to see governments doing at both the local and the national level is moving away from looking at, are they increasing GDP, to the simple question, are they improving the quality of anyone's life?
Great, and that is incredibly important. Also, as Steve, you write in your book, in Peace in the Age of Chaos, one of the more interesting and important findings from IEP's research is the strong link between peace and economic prosperity. And that what's more, there's a tipping point. If peace passes a certain point, then economic prosperity takes off. Can you expand and also perhaps share your understanding of prosperity and feelings about GDP in our current age?
Right. Well, I thought Henrietta's explanation there I thought was excellent. I thought there's a lot in it. So I'll try and sort of add to it from a few different directions. So let's look at GDP, okay, and why we're so obsessed with GDP, because it was really designed during the Second World War. It wasn't meant to really last past the end of the Second World War. But what happened is when GDP contracted, it got tied up with election cycles and governments got unelected. And that then created an obsession with increasing GDP. But GDP is only a sum total of the aggregate of economic activity within an economy. It doesn't count the things which are bad for the economy. Okay, so crime breaks out, it's good. Your house burns down, you've got to reconstruct it again. That's good for GDP. Alcohol's good for GDP, so is the consumption of various forms of drugs. So it's the first thing. So it doesn't necessarily count what's good, it just counts everything. The second thing with GDP is it has no concept of a capital account. It's only counting activity. So you can see it during the COVID recession. You can draw on your capital account to fund your expenses, but in the long run, it's got to run out. It's got to run out, and now you end up in a debt trap. So there's also, we start to now look at the ecology. No value is put on the sustainability of the environment in which we live in terms of GDP. So that concept of a capital account just doesn't exist, So that's a few of the real flaws with GDP. The other thing too, one of the great ways of increasing GDP is to increase your population growth. Excellent. Sort of, if you're down in Africa, you can see GDP going through the roof, but there's going to be less and less resources for those people to be able to have to generate the food which they need to live on. Similarly, if we start to now, this builds out a little bit of Henrietta's comments. So now if we start to now look down and we look at Africa, we'll pick up on the comment I made earlier on, where 2/3 of the population is food insecure. The first thing people want is food to eat, then probably a house, then probably a safe environment in which to live. They'd be first two requirements of most people. Counting GDP, if you've got the food prices increasing, that's probably good for GDP, but it's not good for people's food insecurity. Now, having said that, I'll now come back and talk about GDP, because it still is the major measure of society today. Then I'll pull it back into some of our work there. So if we look at the cost of violence to the global economy in 2020, it was $15 trillion. That's 11.6% of global GDP. That's truly It's a stunning amount. Now, just to put that in perspective, 1% of that $15 trillion is the equivalent of all overseas developmental aid, which was spent in 2020, 1%. Now, no one here can actually imagine a world which is more peaceful. Sorry, none of us here can imagine a world which is absolutely peaceful. But we can all imagine a world which is 10% more peaceful. So it'd be about $1.5 trillion. That'd be the equivalent of adding 3 new economies to the world, the size of Switzerland, Denmark, and Ireland. Now, if you could take that money and direct it towards some of the major problems of the world, now that would really go a long way. Now, we look at the positive peace as our measures for what works for an optimal society. And so positive peace is the attitude, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. And we arrive at that through a whole series of mathematical modelling and statistics based around the Global Peace Index. But what we find is the same things which create for a highly peaceful society also create for a lot of other things we think are important. So higher per capita income, better performances on measures of the ecology, better performance on measures of well-being and happiness, better measures of inclusiveness, and many, many more. Therefore, in many ways, we think it describes an optimal environment under which human potential can flourish. And so just on the economic side of it, countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries deteriorating, on average have 2% per annum higher GDP growth rates. Their inflation rates and their interest rates are much lower. The volatility in inflation is 3 times less, foreign direct investments higher, as is the sovereign debt ratings, and also the exchange rates tend to increase over time compared to decreasing for countries which are falling in positive peace. And what we notice in the dynamics of positive peace is their tipping points. And so there's tipping points with a whole range of things. And so 2 of them, one is GDP, the other is corruption. And so we'll just focus on corruption, for example. So if we're looking at corruption, you can increase the levels of corruption without much impact on peace. So you get to a certain point, and small increases in corruption and peace just slides off a cliff. And so that's one example of the one type of tipping point. And I could go into the detail of it, but I probably haven't got the time. Now, what I would say, and I think this is just incredibly important. Let's look at Afghanistan. So on the most conservative estimates, the US spent $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan. That's the most conservative estimates. It's probably more like $5 to $7 trillion they actually expended. Now, if we look at that, that's 100 times the average, sorry, it's 100 times the per capita income of an Afghan, 100 times. Now, we spent all that money there and we couldn't get a satisfactory result for 40 million people. Now, if we keep going the way we're going with development, we start to try and look at other issues, particularly wicked issues where there's a whole lot of conflict like in the Sahel, we're not going to do any better. So we need to pick up on new, innovative ideas. So obviously our thrust comes through positive peace and then all the systems work we do with it. Henrietta's comes back to those new ideas of the prosperity, particularly the community-focused ones, which I think are excellent ideas. But we need to start to now look at this and really embrace it wholeheartedly. We need to embrace it with vigor because we are actually failing.
Great, thank you, Steve. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss next, actually, is looking at how we tackle the types of challenges that we've been discussing. And we clearly need to adjust our traditional approaches to development and policy making. Henrietta, in terms of ranking system and indices, you have noted that these can often present us with jarring contradictions. For example, many of the most prosperous countries are also the least sustainable. What advice do you have for us moving forward when it comes to not just creating sustainable countries, but also a more sustainable approach to development and growth in the 21st century?
Well, I think that we've touched on many of the issues that I think are important. So first of all, I think that we have to recognize that many of the most prosperous countries of the world, and many of those who are supporting the transition to net zero in various ways, have actually made their money, if you like, out of fossil fuel extraction or out of other kinds of things which are damaging the planet. And this is an important point to bear in mind. So in other words, there is quite a lot of transformation that's going to have to take place in those very prosperous countries to make sure that we're not continuing investment into the extraction of fossil fuels and into extractive economic value systems. So the fact that some people are doing well and are very prosperous doesn't mean that everybody else is. This is something we've just been talking about. I think the other thing that's very important is putting the co-design with local communities at the core of prosperity. And that means expanding our ideas around what collaboration means and who we're collaborating with. Governments don't usually think of themselves as collaborating with communities to deal with these kinds of issues. And I think that's very important. I was also involved as an advisor on the Dasgupta review on biodiversity, which was published earlier in this year. And that really showed the collective shortcomings that countries have pursued towards high growth at the expense of nature and the planet. And we're now currently in a scenario which is a genuine tipping point, where not only our demands for the Earth's resources far exceed the supply of them, but also that we haven't thought about how we will deal now with the uncertainty that will come if we tip over into the next phase. And that was discussed a great deal at COP. But what we didn't really do was to take up this point that Steve was raising in his last comments, which is how do we do some actual form of natural capital accounts that really works for countries? So we have the knowledge of how to do this now. It's a complex process, let's face it, but we're not actually really doing it. The treasuries of various countries are not, although there are some very good leaders. So New Zealand is a leader, for example, Iceland is a leader, Scotland is a leader. There are leaders, but we need more leaders, more people who move towards natural accounting in a way that takes account of natural capital and what needs to be done there. Because we have to recognize that one of the difficulties is that countries, because of the way that they're tied into the international process and the multilateral process that's going on, they're still talking about fixing things. Listen to their language. How do we get back to 1.5 degrees above historic levels, right? How do we, improve the situation that we're in? Now, all of that is not really taking account of what the transformations that need to take place in the next phase. So, for example, one of the things that was announced at COP was that there are a very, very large number of trees. I can't even remember now what the number was, but it was an enormous number of trees are going to be planted across the world, okay? And of course, we all like the idea of this tree planting, and we're all basically in favor of it. And it is an extremely important action. We should be doing it. But how transformative in our thinking about the way in which we have to have a new relationship with the planet is the idea of planting trees. I just don't think it's not sufficiently transformative. And that really is the issue, is how do we move to a new way of thinking about our social and economic and political systems, not how do we fix the one that has currently caused all the problems, because it will just carry on causing those problems.
Yeah, thank you. And Steve, as the creator of the Global Peace Index, you've been emphatic in emphasizing the widening inequality in peace, but at the same time cautioning that our Western democracies are on squeaky wheels. The COVID pandemic in particular has sharpened the focus on certain socioeconomic factors that have been brewing, such as the deteriorating labor conditions in developed countries and increasing alienation within political systems. What is your prognosis for our increasingly fragile democracies and advice for the leaders of these democracies?
So I might just pick up on a couple of Henrietta's comments first, like the idea of planting trees. It's just really easy to do. You can count the number of trees and it's an easy milestone, but the problem is generally 9 out of 10 trees you plant die, okay? So it's what you really need is to be looking at the biomass coverage and saying, well, we're going to take our country and we're going to increase the biomass coverage by 30%, okay? Now, that's much more a eloquent way of being able to try and solve a problem. And there are ways of doing it. The other thing I'd like to just pick up on is the concept of consumerism. And like, we look at the overconsumption of resources on the planet. It's driven firstly by too many people on the planet, but secondly, just the way we go about sort of the building GDP, and that's through a consumer environment, a large part of it fueled by advertising and marketing. To really come back to have a sustainable planet, we have to change these things, and these are not easy things to change because they're built right into the heart of the system. When we look at systems also, let's just move into the question you asked earlier. So if we look at systems, what we find is that they have a steady state in the homeostasis. And so trying to change the system itself will always try and bounce back to its steady state. And that we can see with GDP, and that we can see with consumerism from a whole range of different checks and balances, people's employment, the way companies make profits, and we go on with many, many more. So we come back and we look at the world today. There is growing global inequality and peace. The countries at the top end of the index are getting more peaceful, while the countries at the bottom end of the index are getting less peaceful. And in terms of systems thinking, these are tractor planes. So once you get to a highly peaceful country, in the time we've been doing the Global Peace Index, no country has slipped out of it to be really unpeaceful. Similarly, at the bottom end of the index, we all know of a conflict track, very, very hard to get out of it. Now, as we start to dig down into positive peace, what we find is that globally, it's improving, which is great, but it's divided up into 3 different components: attitudes, institutions, and structures. So we'll start with structures. They've been improving quite strongly over the last decade, let's say. So they're things like, let's say, gender inequality, they're things like GDP growth, their life expectancy, education levels, and their structures. So they're right across the world, or across most nations in the world, are improving. The institutions, however, have been staying pretty static. They're not really improving. But the attitudes have been deteriorating. So now, what are some of those attitudes which are deteriorating? They're deteriorating in the high democracies as well. I'll just come back to that in a second. So if we're looking today, democracy is on the decline globally. So there are only, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, only 23 full democracies in the world. And in every region of the world other than Asia, in the last year, democracy slipped. So democracy does have squeaky wheels, and we can see with the rise of a number of authoritarian states, it's being challenged. It really is being challenged, including around being an economic growth model. So now let's come back to the attitudes. Where are they slipping? So there are concepts like group grievances. They're on the increase. This is in Western democracies. I'll just stick with the Western democracies. It's on the increase. We look at the concept of fractionalized elites. That's where the elites spend more time fighting amongst themselves. That's on the increase. We can find the inequality, multiple measures of inequality. They're on the increase as well. We can find misinformation is on the increase. Faith in democracy is decreasing, and corruption is also on perceptions of corruption, because it's hard to measure directly. Perceptions of corruption are on the increase as well. So what's needed, and so is the free press, okay? Free flow of information, that's deteriorating as well. So these, how would I put it, are symptoms of a systemic problem. We really need to come back and look at the system and work from the system. But that's very, very hard to do. So what I'd postulate, and this is the work at the Institute for Economics and Peace, is that positive peace combined with systems thinking provides a transformational approach to being able to try and reinvigorate our Western democracies, because they are in decline. And I wouldn't describe them as passing a tipping point, but I'd describe them as having squeaky wheels.
Great. And finally, Joan, I want to turn back to you about one of the issues that you've spoken of frequently. You've said previously that while climate change has been recognized as an urgent global issue, the relevance of increasing the visibility of women in clean energy is a possible solution to advancing our climate goals. And this is an idea that's rarely discussed. Do you feel this is still the case? And how do we meaningfully increase women's visibility, not just in clean energy, but across the board? Has enough been done thus far?
I think the first thing I'd say is that it now is discussed far more than it ever was when I made those remarks. I think a lot of that credit goes to the Clean Energy Ministerial Initiative called C3E, which is about empowering women in clean energy. And by the way, that used to be a parallel process to the Clean Energy Ministerial meetings proper. It is now an integral part of them. So that's one symbol, if you will, of how much more attention is being paid. So I would accept that there are a lot of goals now in a lot of places about the involvement of women at senior levels in business or in energy in particular, but the action isn't yet delivering to the extent that it should. I like to tell one story. I was at a Clean Energy Ministerial meeting, and the African Minister of Energy was a woman, a very impressive personality. And she gave a speech to a lot of the women who'd been involved in what was then still a side event. Many young women working in the energy sector. And she recited some of the goals, 30% of this or 20% of that. Hey, she said, we're over 50% of the world's population. Why are we not aiming for equality? Why are we not aiming for 50% representation? Now, we know the answer to that, which is that in the short to medium term, we're not going to make that leap, although considerations of equality and justice would suggest that we should. And it is really important that women are given a say in clean energy, because when they don't have access to clean energy, it's women and girls who suffer. The women and the girls have to fetch the firewood, fetch the water. It keeps the girls out of school and it damages health. A lot of countries still, huge numbers of the population, over 2 billion, still do not have access to clean cooking facilities. And what this means is when it's cold and people are cooking inside, you have respiratory diseases. And the deaths from respiratory diseases, frankly, are far, far greater year on year than the deaths we've seen from COVID. So it's actually a moral imperative as well as considerations of equality, which of course is a moral imperative. But there's another reason, and it's that the evidence base now is really strong that companies who employ women at senior levels, companies which do better on diversity, actually do better and are more profitable in their business operations. So McKinsey had a recent report which said that companies in the top quartile of performance on diversity and inclusion were over 20% more likely to be more profitable than the average. So it's enlightened self-interest. Now look at what's happening. I'm a founding board member of an initiative called Powerful Women in the UK, which seeks to grow the pipeline of women for managerial and board positions. At the moment, the 80 top employers in the energy sector in the UK have 24% of board seats are women. Only 14% of board seats, of executive director seats, are women. So the representation has been augmented primarily by appointing non-executive directors, which is not a bad thing in itself, but it is indicative of what's happening lower down the organisation if you can't appoint executive directors. 28% of that group, of those employers, have no women at all on their boards. And only 18 out of the 80, so that's again just over 20%, have any female executive directors. So this is not a happy picture. And this is in a country where, frankly, we've been paying a lot of attention to this, and the government's shown terrific leadership on having senior female representation on boards generally. But the energy sector is lagging way behind other sectors, even finance, which everybody assumes is less female friendly. So what can we do about it? Well, actually, there's a huge amount we can do about it. You know, the majority of people going to university in the UK are now women. It's over half. So the question of why they're not getting through to these senior positions is an important one. In energy in particular, it's partly because of the choices which women are making about the courses they want to study. So the so-called STEM subjects, science, technology and engineering and management subjects, women are underrepresented. And there is work going on to try to rebalance those courses so that women find them more attractive and women are more represented on them. But within companies, by the time you get your sample, there are problems over recruitment and retention and promotion. And they stem from a range of things: outdated cultures about whether women can actually perform some of these roles. I have to say, I was at another meeting in the Middle East, and this was of young women, and a young woman in the full hijab, the full robes and hijab, stood up and said she had been an engineer on an oil rig. So if it's possible for that to happen in a country with some very strong traditions on the place of women in society, why would any particular role be closed to female applicants? If not closed formally, then closed in the way that the processes are operated. So outdated cultural attitudes, which also affect wastage. I mean, people come in and then the wastage is high, which is not good for companies because you've invested in recruiting and training, but people find the culture hostile. Unconscious bias is really, it's quite startling when you start to investigate it. How advertisements are worded can deter women from applying for roles. Often women will be more diffident about applying because of their perception, because of the image of the role, the image of the company. And companies have to work hard to overcome that. If they word their advertisements in a more female-friendly, more female-sensitive way, they'll get more applications. And this is not about being soft or some other criticism you might make of that approach. This is actually about making processes equally available and perceived to be equally available to women and to men. And then finally, there's a whole issue about inclusive leadership, an inclusive leadership that sets itself goals, I'm coming back to goals again, and makes itself accountable for delivering them. So goals of what the percentage of people are going to be. Now, a goal does not have to be a quota. So you still promote on merit, you recruit on merit, but a goal gives you an idea of where you need to be, and you can track your progress on whether you are making the right sort of progress to get there. There are some outstanding examples of people who've shown leadership in this way, in particular companies, and those companies will be in that McKinsey group who are more highly profitable because they're making use of the talents of all of their workforce. But there are many others who don't yet recognize the real extent of this problem and the need to tackle it. Now, the energy sector is perhaps one of the most extreme examples which I've encountered. I worked in many other sectors before I came into energy, and I was quite shocked. I thought I'd gone back 20 years, actually. And yet I, had some engineering background and so forth before I'd worked in other areas. But it's not just the energy sector. This is an issue for society. And we do come back to the Sustainable Development Goals, which have justice at their heart. And we come back to climate action, because unless we have a fair and just transition to a low carbon economy, we're not going to make it as quickly as we should. We're not going to get the buy-in from our people to accelerate action. And it's not going to be the kind of world in which we want our children to grow up.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Steve, you've put it well in your book that the problem today is not that we are faced with disruptive change, but that we are faced with waves of disruptive change on so many fronts, and that our ability to deal with it must be enhanced. And so a big thank you to you, Joan, Henrietta, and Steve for your time and your insights. And thank you to the CGLN for partnering with IEP in bringing together today's panel. Thank you.